In the last video, we learned 3 simple patterns that let us learn where all the notes are in the key of G across the entire guitar neck. Now we're going to slowly build and expand on that so we have a really strong understanding of what we're playing on the guitar as well. All the scales that we learned last time are what are known as 3-note per string scales. I'm going to quickly explain how they differ from what I call the position scales, and then I'm going to show you that you actually know all of these scales already. To make this easier to understand, we're going to learn just a little bit about intervals. In music, the term interval refers to the distance between 2 notes. The nice thing about intervals is the terminology they use already aligns with the scales that we've been learning. If I choose one of the scales that we worked on last time, and I play the first note in that scale, and then I play that first note again, there's no change in the notes, and I call that a unison or a first. If I play that first note in the scale, and then I play the second note in the scale, then we call that interval a second. And we keep continuing this. If I played the first note in the scale again, and then I played the third note in the scale, we would call that a third, and a fourth, and then a fifth, and then a sixth, and then a seventh, and then an eighth or an octave as we repeat that first note again. Octaves are going to be a really important tool for us moving forward because they're going to show us where patterns repeat themselves. Now, if we move up to the second chunk of scales we learned, I would do the exact same thing. If I repeat this first note, it would be called a unison. If I was to play the first note and then the second note, it would be called a second. And if I was to play the first note and then the third note, that would be called a third. And the first thing you're probably wondering is, how can these be the same interval? This first pattern is whole step, and the second pattern is whole step, half step. So how can they both be thirds? And you're correct. One's a major third and one's a minor third. There's 5 terms that we use to clarify the differences between these intervals: major, minor, perfect, augmented, and diminished. And for now, that's all you need to understand about intervals. The number refers to how many notes you move through the scale. And then we have another term that clarifies exactly what the step pattern is. The first 4 strings of the guitar are tuned in fourths. Between the G and the B string, it's tuned in a third. And then again, between the B and the E string, we have another fourth. So tying that back to what we just learned about intervals, if the interval between these strings is a fourth, that means if I'm starting on a given note, then the next string will be on the 4th note in that scale. First, I'm going to play the scale the normal way. The other way I could play this is if I stayed on the same string. And then these 2 notes are the same. So effectively, the interval between the string tells us how many notes that we play before we arrive at the next string. So if the interval's in fourths, we could play 3 notes until we get to the next string. But we also have a third on the guitar between our G and our B string. And if we play the strings according to the interval, on the G string, we should actually only play 2 notes. So that changes our scale from this to this. Now, the only difference between these 2 patterns is on the G string, I stop 1 note early, and on the last 2 strings, I'm actually using the 2 scale patterns that come from the scale chunk just before this scale chunk. I'm going to show you a quick exercise that's going to help you switch between your 3-note per scale and your position scales. We're going to start with our first scale chunk, and we're going to play through it ascending. And then when we start to descend, we're going to play 1 extra note on the top string sliding down. Then we're going to continue on like it's a position scale. Then we're going to pick up back where we left off with our 3-note per string patterns. So let me play through that one more time. I have that tabbed out in all the positions for you, so that's a good one to add to your daily warm-up. One question you probably have is, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of 3-note per string scales versus position scales? It's generally agreed that playing 3 notes per string is a little bit faster because you get to utilize 3 fingers per string instead of having to just use 2 on the G string. One disadvantage, though, of the 3-note per string scales is you will have to shift when you go from the G string to the B string, because when you play the 3rd note on the G string, you're already playing the 1st note on the B string, so you got to go to the next note. So you always have to shift when you're playing 3-note per string scales. I'm going to show you one more exercise that's going to help blur the lines between all these different scale chunks. We're going to start in the first scale chunk. We're going to play our first 2 strings. Then we're going to slide up to our second scale chunk, and we're going to repeat the string we just played, and then we're going to add in the next string. Then again, we're going to slide up again to our 3rd scale chunk, repeat that same string, and then add in the next string. And we're going to repeat that again. And we can do that one more time before we run out of notes. So putting that all together. Have that tabbed out in all the other positions for you, and that exercise is going to help make it a little bit more fluid when you're moving between scales on the guitar. Now we're going to utilize these patterns that we've been studying a little further to help us identify what notes that we're playing on the guitar. We're going to start with an easy one. This is a G. And the reason we know this is A, if you've been learning chords, this is a G chord. And we've also been learning the G scale, and this is the root position in our G scale. Let's look at this a little bit differently though. Anytime we see pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2, we know that's the start of our root position scale chunk. What you may not know though is, since we're playing in the key of G, every time we start on a G, it has that exact same scale pattern. I mentioned the interval of an octave is important, and that's where this is going to start to come into play. So we have our G here, and if we were to go to an octave or the 8th note in our scale, that takes us here. Now, if I played that note like it was the first note in a 3-note per string scale, these patterns are pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2. So it's the exact same patterns as if we started right here. Pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2. So we know that this is a G. We also know that this is a G because of an octave, and then we know that that pattern repeats again. Pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2. So let's make sure this is consistent. Let's find one more spot on the neck where we have pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2. If we go up to the 10th fret starting on the A string, we again have pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2. And this is indeed a G. So anytime you're playing through your scales and you see pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2, you immediately know that first note in that first pattern is a G. We also know that second note in the pattern 2 is also a G because it is the 8th note and therefore an octave. And that again extends if we start here. We have another octave. If we have pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2, we immediately know that that first note is a G. So we now know if we see pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2, we can quickly know that the first note in that first pattern 3 is a G. As an additional tool, we can use octaves to find more Gs near the original G that we just found. The nice thing about the octave is the pattern is the same whether we're looking at the G or the A or the B notes, but there are 2 octave patterns depending on whether we have to deal with that third interval between the G and the B string. If you're playing on any of the lower strings, your octave pattern looks like this. And you basically go over 2 frets and over 2 strings. But as soon as you're touching either the B or the high E string, then you have to stretch that by 1 more, and you have to go over 3 and then over 2 strings. This is something you will kind of have to memorize, but the good news is when you make a mistake, it'll be very obvious because it'll sound like this. Now that we know our octave patterns, once we identify a G, then we can go an octave up. We can go an octave up from there. So anytime we find a note that we're interested in, we can also very quickly find its octaves. In our G scales, we can quickly identify when we're playing a G because we have pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2. Using this approach, I think the next note that we want to identify is actually even simpler because the pattern is easier to remember. If you ever see 3 pattern 3s in a row, you know the first note is a D. So that note right here, this is a D, and we know this is true because this is the D string. So we've already found our D. We can find another pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 3 on the neck to check again. Still a D. We're good to go. And then we also have our other Ds from the octaves. Now, anytime when we see 3 pattern 3s in a row, we know immediately that that first note is a D. And one more thing to connect those pieces of information, when we identify our G by finding pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2, the pattern before that first pattern 3 is always another pattern 3. So our D always comes 1 string before our G on the beginning of that pattern 3. So we have our D here because we have our pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 3. And then we also have our G here because we have a pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2. Those 3 strings we use to identify where our D is and the 3 strings we use to identify where our G are overlap. So if you find one, you know the other note is always right by it as well. We're going to squeeze in one more note because this pattern is really easy to recognize as well. If you see pattern 2 followed by pattern 1, you know the first note of that pattern 2 is a B. And to make this even easier, you will never see a pattern 1 going into a pattern 2. You will always see a pattern 2 going into a pattern 1. So all you have to remember is if you see both whole step, half step patterns right next to each other, you found your B. So this is a B. I also have that whole step, half step pattern right here. So I know this is a B. Since there's only 2 strings in this pattern, it makes it really quick and easy to identify. And I'm going to show you one other trick about it. That first note on that first string is a B, but the last note on that second string is actually your G again. So immediately, if you see 2 whole step, half step patterns next to each other, you know that first note is a B, and that last note is a G. Now, as we keep practicing our scales, we'll start to be able to identify a few notes. When we see pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 2, we know we're starting with a G. If we see pattern 3, pattern 3, pattern 3, we know we're starting with a D. If we see pattern 2, pattern 1, we know we're starting with a B and ending with a G. And we're going to stop here for today. We've covered a little bit about intervals. We've related our 3-note per string scales to our position scales, and we've utilized some of those easy patterns that we've learned to help identify notes on the neck. We're going to keep building on this from here, so don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.